So now this is to come back around to your first question, which I said, let's not scare the bejesus out of the listeners
Well, let's
right
just
off the
do it.
bat, right?
Yeah.
The thing is, if you spend, any serious time looking into the UFO phenomenon, and by the way, it's something I've studied for 25 years or something like that. I touched on it toward the end of Prometheus and Atlas, which was published in 2016. It was my dissertation in 2012 and then was adapted into a book 2016. And then I wrote Closer Encounters, my study of the UFO phenomenon. Closer Encounters was published in 2021. But it's the outcome of like 20 years of preceding research. So anyone who goes into the UFO phenomenon, with even, half of that depth and endurance of research, inevitably realizes that whether you want to work through what Jacques Vallée's uncovered, or whether, you want to, at least look at Zecharia Sitchin's research, the UFO phenomenon extends through all of recorded human history and most likely into prehistory. And it's absolutely inseparable from both revealed religious systems like Judeo-Christianity and Islam, and also more archaic, how could we put it? Let's just say archaic polytheistic ritualistic religions like the religion of ancient Egypt, or, the Vedic religion, and so on and so forth. It's very clear that, in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the Devas and the Asuras, or what in the Greek language we might call the gods and the Titans, are exactly the same beings as, Elohim, the Elohim in the Bible, or the rebel angels, the Nephilim in the biblical context. They're the same beings as the Anunnaki in Sumerian scriptures, where again you have two factions. This idea that there are two factions runs through every human religious belief system on the planet throughout the course of
Would
history.
you say Prometheus is an archetype of this
Absolutely.
rebel angel?
Absolutely. So, there's a through line from Enki in the Sumerian myths, to Prometheus in the Greek context, to Quetzalcoatl in the Mayan context, to, let's say, a leader of the Asuras in a Hindu context.
Sort of demigod figure that transgresses on behalf of man against the gods.
Exactly.
Brings forth some sort of sacred technology to them.
Exactly. And in a Judeo-Christian context, of course, this is Lucifer. Okay. So, you have the story in the Bible about how the serpent offered knowledge to humanity in Eden. And the reason the humans were kicked out of the garden, where, by the way, they were workers, because, the nakedness in antiquity was a sign of slave labor. And we were tillers of the field in Eden for the gods, except we didn't know it. We didn't know we were naked, meaning we didn't know we were slaves. And this God is threatened by our being given the discernment to recognize good versus evil, because that would mean we'd realize that our overlord is a bastard who wants to deny us knowledge. And what Adonai Elohim, the chief of the gods, says when he casts man out of Eden, or right before he does, is let us, basically exile them from the garden before they also eat of the tree of life and become like unto us, so that nothing becomes impossible to them, right? So this is a God who's jealous and afraid of humans achieving parity with the gods, with the Elohim. And there's this rebel who's symbolized by the serpent. Now, remember, the serpent is punished by having his legs removed. And then in the book of Revelation, Satan is referred to as the dragon, the great dragon, that serpent of old. In other words, Lucifer is explicitly identified with the serpent in Eden. Now, there's all kinds of people who want to argue against this, because they want to save the Christian narrative in a Gnostic sense. And there are people who try to identify Jesus himself with Lucifer, and so on and so forth. I used to teach comparative religion for a few years. And so there are all these nuances, but I think the evidence is there to make the case that the dragon from the book of Revelation is the serpent in Eden. And that's exactly the same figure as Quetzalcoatl, who's also represented as a feathered serpent, as a dragon, essentially. And that's the faction of Enki. And you see the symbol in Egypt, too, of, the serpents with wings coming out the sides of them, with the sun at the center, the symbol of the Shamasu Hor, the followers of Horus. So you have this through every human culture. And the narrative is essentially this, that we were created as workers or slaves or servants of some kind of celestial overlord. And we were put into a caste system, a hierarchy. You know, the word hierarchy literally means holy order, hierarchy, a hierarchical pyramidal society of the kind you saw in ancient Egypt, of the kind that you see in the Varna system, the caste system of India, of the Hindu religion to this day. And at some point, there was a rebellion against this structure. I would say the most compelling version of the narrative of that rebellion is the one you find in Plato's story about Atlantis. But people get hung up on the name Atlantis. If there was such a civilization, probably, its denizens didn't refer to it as Atlantis. Plato uses that term because it signifies something very powerful. Atlantis means the realm of Atlas. And as I point out in my book, Prometheus and Atlas, Atlas is a very powerful metaphor. The idea of Atlas, of someone who has mapped the entire world and bears the earth on his shoulders, right? And actually, the globe that Atlas is bearing on his shoulders is not a terrestrial map, it's a star globe, which is what mariners use to navigate the world, right? And so it's this idea of basically developing a knowledge of the heavens and a mastery over the whole earth and modeling the earth so that we wind up with, let's say, medical atlases. The atlas is a term for a model, right? So this is integral to the model building enterprise of technological science. So the idea of Atlantis archetypally is the idea of a demigod society, which, as Plato says, wanted to empower humans and was hybridizing itself with the lot of humanity, right? And thereby lifting up humanity, not just psychically and intellectually, but also genetically lifting up humanity. It's the idea of using technological science to unlock the secrets of the heavens and achieve parity with the gods, so that you no longer need to be a servile worshiper of some kind of overlord. And this is what Plato tells us was the great sin of the Atlanteans, is that they stopped sacrificing to the gods and worshiping them, so that Zeus basically calls a convocation of the Olympians and decides to wipe the world clean in what we more commonly know as Noah's flood, right? And so the biblical story of Noah is exactly the same thing, especially when you look at, in Genesis 6, right? There's a whole part of that story that's clearly been excised. So in Genesis 6, all of a sudden we're told, like, in rapid succession, oh, well, there was great iniquity on the earth, and God decided to wipe the entire earth clean in the flood. Wait a minute here. And the sons of the Elohim came down, and they found the daughters of man fair, and they, interbred with them, and so on and so forth, and the earth was full of iniquity. Seriously, in 2 paragraphs, you're going to tell us that God regretted the entire creation and wiped the whole world clean, right? There's a backstory here. And you find the backstory preserved in the book of Enoch, which was first discovered in Ethiopia. And it clearly was at one point part of the Tanakh and was excised, due to whatever, kind of, theological power game that whoever was playing.
You feel confident that it was part of the original?
For sure, because the story makes no sense without it. And what you see in the book of Enoch is a direct Hebraic parallel to what you see in Plato's account of Atlantis. And then, other cultures have their own versions of that. The Mayans do too.
In Enoch, it's the Watchers or whatever. And so, okay, how does all of this connect to the UFO story? Because you hear, I don't know, like, for example, Diana Pasulka came on my podcast and she said, Jacques Vallée is very interested in the devil and demons and fallen angels.
I'm having lunch with Jacques Vallée. So we're in his study, and it's really amazingly beautiful here in the Bay Area. And he starts to explain a couple of things to me, and I notice a bunch of books on shelves, and I notice those things, right?
Yeah.
So I go and I start to look to see what he has on this one shelf, and then he takes one of the books off, and it was a book about angels. And he says, of course, you can't have one without the other, right? Because he picked up another book and he said, you need to read this book. And whenever he says that to me, of course, I'm going to get the book and read it. But this one was weird. So he showed it to me, and it was The History of Satan. It just had these big words on it that says Satan. And again, if I wasn't a little bit concerned before, I was absolutely concerned at that point. I was like, Jacques Vallée is handing me this book that says Satan on it. And so he said, look at the pagination. So I, looked at the pagination. It was 666.
Whoa.
Yeah, I thought that was so, of course.
Wild.
It was a really weird moment. And he said that in the States, we think of Satan or the devil as really, really terrible, right? But, he said that the French, they have a different view of it, and it's less sensationalist. That's what he was saying.
So what does all of this have to do with the modern kind of UFO topic?
Well, I knew Jacques Vallée for a while, and
I spoke to him this morning, actually.
Yeah. So after, I think it was 7, within 9 months of the time Prometheus and Atlas came out, he had invited me to his home, and we had a nice dinner and a fairly intimate conversation. And I brought this question up with him, and because we were discussing basically, and we'll come around to this, time travel, and whether, he believed that these were basically humans that were reaching back into our epoch from the future, and that essentially, there was a breakaway civilization that had developed a hyperdimensional relationship to the various space-times of the epochs of human history. That a breakaway civilization with time travel essentially was able to have a fifth dimensional relationship with the various 4D space-times of different human historical epochs, right? And I basically said to him, well,
some sort of multiverse management system.
Yes, and I think that's a
branch management system.
And I think that's definitely part of what's going on, right? So how I start my book, Closer Encounters, is I lay out all the different hypotheses. Of course, the ETH, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and then, time travel, interdimensional hypothesis, the psychic projections hypothesis, crypto-terrestrial, meaning survivors of Atlantis, which we're touching on here, and ultimately also avatars of a simulacrum. Are we living in a simulacrum? Are these in some sense avatars from the programming level of the simulacrum, which is something that Vallée, as a computer scientist, also has intimated in various writings of his. So, but the point is this, that, we were discussing this, hyperdimensional, extratemporal relationship that these entities have to humans in various historical epochs. And I said to him, well, if this is what you think, why aren't you more direct about expressing that? And he said, because it involves deeply entrenched religious sensibilities of various societies. And there's a sociological dimension to this that could be catastrophic in terms of religious belief systems.
But you're skipping over one part, which is, what does he think? What is the relationship between, the devil, demonic, and UFOs and all this stuff?
I didn't pin him down on that, so I don't want to speak for him, but I suspect that what a lot of people are concerned about, including people in the deep state of our own government, first and foremost, is that the bad guys won. In the struggle over reshaping human history, we wound up losing a rebellion against a control system that abides to this day. And the meta-narratives that have dominated the rise and fall of various societies throughout the course of history, including, for example, the destruction of the secular humanistic culture of the late Roman Empire, the Library of Alexandria, libraries at Corinth, the entire, that I'm getting this figure from Carl Sagan. We lost 98% of the knowledge of classical antiquity. They have actually done studies based on the references that we do have to other texts by various authors in the classical manuscripts that have survived, and they've been able to do a reconstruction that shows that we lost at least 98% of the knowledge of classical antiquity. Well, who does that benefit?
Let's talk about a guilt-free alternative to alcohol that's perfect for your dry January or any time you want to unwind. Cornbread's organic CBD gummies. These gummies are an absolute lifesaver for my evening routine. They're a natural way to relax, celebrate, or wind down without the hangover. I've cut back a lot on my alcohol consumption over the last few years. For a lot of you trying out dry January or cutting back generally,